Now, I'm the chair of this session. The Australian voice might rankle with some of you, but you'll get used to it. So welcome to this particular session of Left Forum. Is the Rosenberg case closed? If so, what does it mean and why won't the right accept it? Well, the Rosenberg case refuses to go away. There have been an enormous number of books that have come out, not only in the 50s, but in the 70s and the 80s. And this has continued. 2 years ago, in 2009, John Haynes, Harvey Clare and Alexander Vasiliev published Spies with the subtitle The Rise and Fall of the KGB in America. Late last year, this book, Final Verdict by Walter, and many of you may already be familiar with this, Walter and Miriam, and the late Walter Schneir and Miriam Schneir. This came out now 40 years ago, probably more than 40 years ago. They've been working on Invitation to an Inquest, and that appeared in successive editions, 1965, 1973 and 1983. Now, the point in referring to these two books is that the gulf between them is wide, and that's indicative of the resilience of the contested positions on this case. The first book uses Vasiliev's notebooks to confirm, as well as other Soviet sources and the Venona decrypts, there'll be some mention of those today, to confirm Julius Rosenberg's guilt. The second book, this one, suggests that the role of Ruth, and as you know, is Ethel's sister, of Ruth and David Greenglass in atomic espionage was far greater than they or we had previously imagined or recognised, and that the role of Julius, and certainly of Ethel, was minimal. So what this suggests, and this will be discussed to some extent here today, is that they were convicted and condemned of a crime, atomic espionage, that they did not, in fact, commit. Now, if this is the case, a major miscarriage of justice has occurred. And such miscarriages of justice do not have a use-by date. Now, I was going to read out from you an absolutely sensational little piece where Alan Dersovich quotes from Roy Cohn, but given that we're starting late, I'll leave that. But it's Roy Cohn, almost on his deathbed, admitting the fabrication of evidence, but I'll leave that. We might return to that some later. So what I'd now like to very briefly do is introduce our three speakers. On my immediate right is Jeff Kisseloff, journalist, historian, author of 5 books, 3 of them on oral history, which is his speciality. And he's currently writing a book on the Hiss case. He was once Alger Hiss's researcher and is still the driving force behind algerhiss.com, which many of you would have already accessed, because it's and I use it in my teaching in Victoria University in Melbourne. So it's a very comprehensive site on the Hiss case, and it was established approximately 10 years ago with Alger's son Tony. The next speaker, and each of these speakers has in some way played a direct or indirect role in the events that we'll be discussing today, some more direct, some more active. And that second category is certainly the case with Miriam Moskowitz, and she's the author of this book, which was also published late last year, Phantom Spies, Phantom Justice. And I have to read out the subtitle because it's quite amazing, because it's a whole cast of the usual suspects. Elizabeth T. Bentley, Harry Gold, Roy Cohn, Irving Sapol, Judge Irving Kaufman, J. Edgar Hoover, and the rehearsal for the Rosenberg trial, or How I Survived McCarthyism. She and Abe Rothman were indicted in 1950 for conspiracy to commit justice.
That would be nice.
That's what you call a Freudian slop. So as to, of course, obstruct justice. They were convicted and spent 2 years in a federal penitentiary. So in a sense, we've got a living fossil from a survivor from those years. Now, like the Rosenberg case, I'll be very quick. I'll be very quick on this. Like the Rosenberg case, this had strong overtones of Soviet espionage. 2 government witnesses, Harry Gold, whom we'll hear about today, and Elizabeth Bentley, then called the so-called Spy Queen, who were very soon to testify in the Rosenberg case, testified in this. So in many ways, their trial, Miriam and Abe's, was the harbinger of the Rosenberg trial. Now, Miriam, as I understood it, knew Ethel quite well.
She met her in prison.
Yep, and even was in contact with her in jail. More significantly, in 3 months' time, I'm terribly sorry, she'll be 95 years old. The last speaker on my far right, your left, is Michael Meeropol. Many of you would already know that he's the elder son of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. He's the co-author with Robbie, his brother, of, it's a wonderful title, it's quite defiant, We Are Your Sons, the legacy of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, which has gone into 2 editions. And he's also the editor of the Rosenberg Letters, and the full subtitle is A Complete Edition of the Prison Correspondence of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And anyone who's read any of that correspondence will be struck by the intensity and the passion, not only in their own innocence, but towards each other and towards their sons. Some of it is incredibly moving correspondence. Now, amongst other activities, Michael is currently a visiting professor of economics and interdisciplinary studies at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at Kearney City University, of New York. You can tell I'm from Australia. So without further ado, I'd like to open this up. It's going to be more of a conversation between the 3 people here than a sort of a straight didactic show and tell. So I'll hand it over to, I think, Jeff first. Thank you.
I'm an oral historian by training, and so it just simply occurred to me, since I was asked to host or run the panel, to run this like I do my regular interviews, which is run it like a conversation, and a nice, relaxing, congenial conversation.
Could you go louder, please?
I'll do the best I can about some horrendous events that took place 60 years ago. Before I start, let me just say, just briefly, what an honor it is to sit here with 2 people who overcame the most awful circumstances. Miriam going to prison for a crime that she didn't commit, having her whole life disrupted. Michael, whose parents were murdered by the US government. Yet both of them went on not only to become real scholars, but to become decent, humane people, devotees to getting justice not only for their cases, but for political justice today. And I'm sure with both Miriam and Michael, the lessons of their parents had a lot to do with making them the fine human beings that they became. And speaking of parents, let me start off with that. Miriam, you came of age during the Depression. How did that, and you became a political radical. How did the Depression and what you saw in the Depression help form who you became? What did you see?
I saw unemployment and I saw people suffering, and I knew in my own home we were having a terrible time. It was not simple to come to a conclusion that there had to be a better way. unemployment was rife. Nobody was doing anything about it. The war in Europe was becoming a reality for Americans, particularly for Jews. And there was chaos. I graduated in the middle of from high school in the middle of the Depression. I didn't know what to do with myself. Nobody did. It was just totally unreasonable and unhappy.
You were at City College at night,
Yeah.
in the middle of when so much activism was taking place. What was it like to be on that campus when it was so alive?
I was in the evening session.
Right.
And I would get there at 6 o'clock after work, and the campus was alive with students arguing and speaking and having street corner meetings every 100 feet. There'd be a speaker. And many of these students were offspring of first generation American Jews. They were concerned about the war in Europe and the news that was coming about Jews being loaded onto boxcars. Also, their parents were members, most of them, of unions, the ILGWU, the Amalgamated, the Painters Union, the Furries Union. Their parents were all conscious of their role as workers, and this was transferred to the students, so that the ferment on the students reflected a kind of class consciousness, and it reflected the fear that the war in Europe was going to reach here, because we had anti-Semitic ravings from people like Father Coughlin and Gerald L.K. Smith, and nobody was doing anything about it except the Communist Party. So these students became aware, politically aware, and it began to permeate and percolate through to my consciousness.
Michael, your father was there. I know the stories must have been passed down to you. Can you give us a feel for what it was like for him?
Well, one of my favorite stories is one that actually got confirmed when one of the actors wrote me a letter after Robbie and I published We Are Your Sons. It's a story my father tells in a letter about a meeting that the president of CCNY, probably in 36 or 37, had a bunch of Italian fascist students come to CCNY to speak. The audience was filled with a whole bunch of anti-fascists who greeted the entrance with boos, to which the president said, "You're all behaving like gutter snipes." And it was so noisy that the president said, "Listen, if you quiet, we'll let the head of the student body speak." His name was Edward Alexander. So he goes up to speak and he says, "I've been told that I can't say anything against our speakers today, but I'd like to bring a greetings to our brothers in Italy who have been tricked by fascism." My father's version of it is that the students rush Alexander, a fight goes on, the whole crowd erupts, "Abbasso il fascismo," and then my father says, and then City College had the New York's finest come in and give us a lesson in nightstick physics. Nightstick civics. Nightstick physics too, but civics. Nightstick civics. So they all walk around campus with pins saying, "I am a gutter snipe, I hate fascism," but Eddie Alexander is expelled. And he moves to Canada, and in 1975 he writes me a letter, having read it in We Are Your Sons, and says, "I had no idea that the gutter snipe impact had such an impact on Julius." So that's the kind of stuff that went on, and I have to give a plug for my daughter's film, Heir to an Execution. If anybody in this room has not seen it, don't admit it to me. In it, Abe Osheroff, a veteran of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, somebody who went to Mom and Dad's wedding, he says, City College in Berkeley makes, City College in the 30s makes Berkeley in the 60s look tame. And that's just what Miriam's talking about. And notice, it spills over into the evening. This is not just the privileged kids at noon, and then they go home to mommy and daddy. This is working class kids from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m.
So you said you were about to say something.
Yes, I want to follow. I didn't know that. There was a song at City College, and I won't sing it, but I'll give you the lines. High on the hill stands the City College, where the gutter snipes come for knowledge hell bent. High on the hill stands the City College, but the biggest bluff of all is the president. And it goes on.
Fantastic.
Can you remember that for how many years?
He still remembered. Then, Michael, you were 7 when the arrest happened. At that age, were you aware at all of being in a political house?
Well, only with hindsight.
Right.
I've told this story before, but
Right.
what the hell?
What the hell?
I'm 6 years old, maybe 5 years old, and I make believe I'm a bridge. I'm down on all fours, and my father takes a building block, and it's a convoy. It's a truck, it's going over the bridge. This is World War II stuff, So the American army goes over the bridge, and then the Russian army goes over the bridge, and then the fascists come over the bridge, and I raise up like this. Hey, he smiles. Hey, shake hands, bridge. You killed the fascists. So I knew about that.
Right.
And that was really about it.
Right.
I mean, when I was 7, living in the shelter, I remember still thinking the Russians were our allies because of World War II,
Right.
and that I didn't know that, in fact, the Koreans were the enemies, but somehow the Russians and the Americans were allies, that sort of stuff.
What about the collection cup for the Spanish?
Oh, no, don't remember that.
No recollection.
Don't remember that.
No. Now, let's skip up to the 40s. You go to work for Abe Rothman. Tell us something about Abe and the activities that Abe was involved in. Because this is what directly leads to the Rosenberg
You mean
case.
business activities?
Business activities.
Right. He was never involved in any social protest movement. He was not a member of the Communist Party. He was certainly aware of politics acutely, but he was not a joiner, and he did not participate. But he was a chemical engineer who had entered Columbia College on a full scholarship at the age, accepted at the age of 14, entered at 15, became an engineer, graduate chemical engineer at 19, at maybe 19, and got a job immediately, the height of the Depression, with a firm in Pittsburgh. And he wasn't there very long when he became chief engineer. He was still about 19 years old when this happened. He did a lot of writing of things he had explored having to do with engineering, and the reason he did that, he published in engineering journals in the United States. The reason he did it was that it got him publicity, and that got inquiries because he had become a consulting engineer.
But he had a business relationship with Soviet purchasing, correct?
Okay.
Right.
He was alone as a consultant, and business wasn't coming his way, but he foresaw in the early 40s, maybe earlier, that the Soviet Union was going to have to rebuild its industry when the war was over, because they had been almost wiped out during the war, and he wanted part of that business. He tried approaching them directly, and he never got past the front desk. But these articles had gotten him noticed among from various people, one of whom was a man by the name of Jacob Golos, who approached him and said, look, I have connections with Altfather, the Soviet Purchasing Commission, and we can, if we can arrange a business arrangement, I'll represent you and maybe get you some business.
Now, the business that he gave them, there was nothing secret involved in any of his formulas, was there?
Rothman never worked for the government. He never worked on anything secret. Everything he gave them, and if you choose to believe that it was helping them or that it was simply an overture for business, either way, it was his own work. It wasn't secret, wasn't connected with the government.
Can I interrupt
Sure.
and say that at Miriam and Abe's trial, the government admitted it in open court, that there's no assertion that anything that is discussed by the prosecution witnesses about what Abe did was secret.
But yet Haynes and Clare insist that, based on the notes, that he was involved in espionage. You know that was not true.
Yeah, that sells books, maybe. It was not true. Haynes and Clare said that Abe had been a spy and he had furnished, he was a long-time asset to the Soviet Union. He had furnished all kinds of information. This was simply not true.
Well, he did furnish information, just not secret
Yes,
information,
but not,
right? Right.
but it
Wasn't espionage.
wasn't secret.
Now, there was a fellow who worked in the lab who would play a huge role in both your cases. Who was?
Harry Gold.
Harry Gold. And Harry Gold essentially put you in prison, yet you write quite sympathetically about Harry Gold to some extent.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I knew Harry, and he was, what we used to say, he was a sad sack. He had never had a break in his life. He had worked, when he first started working, early in the Depression, it was a 7-day-a-week job, and he never got paid very much. And he was the sole support for a while of his parents. What I understood about him was that when the government, when he confessed to the government, the reason he went so far afield and confessed that I had been involved and Rothman had been involved, he was telling the FBI what he knew they wanted to hear, for the reason that they held over him the fact that they were going to foreclose on the house that all three of them lived in, the father and brother and Harry, and that his elderly father would be then thrown out on the streets, as would his brother, who was somewhat handicapped and couldn't find easily couldn't find employment, and he was frightened to death. I don't think he was so concerned about himself because he never expected a 30-year sentence. And I don't think when he later testified against the Rosenbergs that he ever felt the sentence they would get would be so barbaric. And that's why I think he felt he had no way to turn. He was going to save his father and his brother, and he was going to tell the FBI whatever they wanted to know.
Now, before I move on to final verdict, I want to ask you, and then we're going to come back to your case. But tell us, one of the things in your book which really got to me, and actually it was the first chapter of the book, was your arrest, which reads almost like a Robert Ludlum novel. Just tell us briefly about the circumstances of your arrest and charges. Where were you and how you knew it was happening?
It was a Saturday afternoon. I had gone down with Abe. We were involved in opening a plant to make a hair preparation, and it was going to be the big thing in everybody's life because it was going to really be flourishing business. It was Saturday afternoon. We were followed all the way from New York City down to the Jersey Shore area where the plant was by the FBI. We had been followed with them the night before, followed by them the night before. Hoped they would go away, but another car was there, parked outside my house in the morning. When Abe came to pick me up, they followed us all the way down to the plant. And we couldn't figure out, I couldn't figure out why they were, what they were doing, but I was not very happy about their presence. About 4 o'clock, they parked. The plant was in a huge sandy field, and they parked about 500 feet away, and I was sitting outside watching them, and they were watching us. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 cars joined them. And then the 3 cars swooped down to the plant. A bunch of men got out and said to me and said to Brosnan, "You're under arrest." And I said, "What for?" And they said, "Conspiracy to obstruct justice." And I couldn't understand that, but I heard the word obstruct, and I was in a daze now, and it seemed to me that what they were talking about was obstructing traffic. Traffic violation. I couldn't figure out what this was all about. The 2 of us were arrested. There were 3 men assigned to each car. We weren't taken back in the same car. And we traveled north to New York. When we got through the tunnel, the radio began to crackle with police jargon. And then they pulled up to Foley Square, which was the headquarters of the FBI, as well as the courthouse. And when we got there, it was about 6 o'clock, and there was a swarm of newspapermen and photographers, and they went to town. This was well staged. So
And
that's the
is
beginning.
that the pic?
Yes.
Yes, so here's the headline in the Daily News, and the photo of Miriam being arrested, which is in the book. And a hair preparation on spy charts.
Wait, notice the sub-headline though.
Yeah.
Madman woman in
spy
spy plot.
which is what they would do.
Well, you have to know there were a number of arrests before then. They were staged one after the other, and the country was lit up with fear by this time. It was a terrible time.
Now, Michael, going to move ahead a little bit. There have been a dozen, more than a dozen, 2 dozen books on the Rosenberg case. 3 last year. But Final Verdict seems like a different book in many ways. It's reasonable to ask whether Walter Schneir has closed the case. Essentially using the documents pulled up by even right-wing historians. And he has actually taken them and looked at them instead of just using them to call names. Let's talk about the key evidence from Walter's research that does seem to close the case. To you, what is the most important? What are the 2 or 3 most salient points?
Well, let's start with the fact that Walter and Miriam in 1965 looked at all the available evidence, and they came to the conclusion that Klaus Fuchs was a spy, the German-born British scientist, but that everything else in the Rosenberg-Sobel case is a fraud. Harry Gold is Walter Mitty. He's the guy who walks into the police station and confesses to the latest crime on the front page. David Greenglass is scared into confessing to a crime he didn't commit to save his wife and to save himself from the death penalty. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg just happened to be unlucky enough to be related to David Greenglass. That was what we believed, following Walter and Miriam from 1965 basically into the 80s. And Walter and Miriam changed their mind in 1995. My brother and I remained, quote unquote, agnostic until Morty Sobel told the New York Times that yes, he had been involved.
But you changed your mind too.
Yeah. I would say that we began to evolve our thoughts, at least when the Venona decryptions came out. Now, for those of you who don't remember, it's the National Security Agency actually intercepted coded Soviet cables and were able to decipher some of them. And some of them related to the activities of a spy codenamed Liberal. The FBI, when David Greenglass was arrested, there's a file, suddenly it says, Liberal is Julius Rosenberg, Caliber is David Greenglass, WASP is Ruth Greenglass. And that is how they end up arresting my father as an atomic spy. It's the CIA. Are you going to believe it just because they say it? I think skepticism was, okay. It wasn't a bad idea to be skeptical. Walter and Miriam were convinced. We weren't. By 2008, we were convinced when Morty came out with his story. And what Walter did is he went beyond that to say, okay, Julius Rosenberg was involved in recruiting people to help the Soviet Union during World War II. But what about the specifics of the trial? And he was able, because he knew all the cross-references, he was able to do something that people who actually had the documents in front of them were either too blinded by ideology or too blinded by lack of knowledge or maybe even just plain old laziness to not see.
You can only interrupt. I had a back and forth with John Haynes at NYU, and I asked him specifically, I said, look, are you there just to pull names from there, or are you there to actually analyze these documents? And he said, no, my job isn't to analyze the documents. We get the names, we collect the names, we put the names out there. That's all I do.
All right, well, fair enough. But it was even more interesting than that. There's a book that was published in 1999 called The Haunted Wood, which was the first round of this guy Vasilyev. Some of you may know this, but it's fascinating. The Soviet ex-KGB decided that they would auction off some of their goodies to Western journalists and book publishers and stuff like that, but on their terms. They let this guy Vasilyev, who's Russian, so he reads Russian, they let him go in there, look at the stuff, take notes, and walk out. Never duplicating the stuff, never bringing any of the stuff out. So everything that is in The Haunted Wood and in Spies and in these massive Vasilyev notebooks that are online, hundreds, maybe even thousands of pages, is all his writing what he remembers seeing, and it may or may not be accurate, which is one of the things...
Selective documents.
Right. One of the things Walter did is he said, okay, is there any way to get independent judgment about whether any of this stuff is true? He actually met two people in Mexico who are the subject of these documents. He said to them, these documents say this about you. Are they accurate? And both of them said, yeah, they are. So that was 2 for 2. Walter said, I think I'm going to treat these as accurate. Now, obviously, some of them may not be. So Walter takes all these things together, and he discovers that right there in The Haunted Wood, which was published over 10 years ago, is stuff that directly contradicts the trial testimony, including some very important stuff like the argument that Ruth Greenglass makes at the trial that if Ethel hadn't urged me to ask David, I never would have said it, because I was really scared when Julius said, please recruit David to be a spy. But Ethel said, you should really ask David. Well, according to the Vasilyev version of it, all Ethel says is, be very careful. And that is a difference. And let me tell you, it's not an irrelevant difference, because now that Walter's book has come out, if you want to bore yourself and get yourself upset, you can go to Commentary, the Weekly Standard, or the New Republic and read reviews by the usual suspects of right-wing scholars who have a serious axe to grind.
You're sliding way ahead. We're going to get to that.
Okay.
You're sliding way ahead. But there's something else in there about Julius being told, you're out.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Very important.
That's also
Right.
in The Haunted Wood in
Right.
1999. In January 1945, my father was fired from his job with the United States Signal Service, the United States Signal Corps. Why? Because he was a communist. Now, if you're a Soviet KGB operative and you see one of your people fired for being a communist, you might suspect, hey, do they know even more? Then that's what they did. They said, you know, maybe the FBI is on to more than just the fact that this guy's a communist. So we tell him, sever all your relationships with all your contacts. You're no longer a spy. And Walter headlines the thing, a pink slip from the KGB. This is February 1945. And why is that important? Because the major event that leads the prosecutor at the trial to say, these people stole through David Greenglass the secret of the weapon that may hold the key to our country's survival, the atomic bomb. It supposedly happens in September 1945 in the Rosenberg apartment, when the famous cross-section of the atom bomb, the one that the government brought in somebody to authenticate and say it illustrates the important secret principle. Leave aside the fact that it's got errors in it and there's all sorts of much more useful stuff coming from the Soviet Union. Leave that aside. This document is the key to Kaufman's sentencing speech and Eisenhower's refusal to grant clemency. We find out, according to Walter's research, that my father has been fired from his job with the KGB. That meeting in September 1945 never takes place. And there's one other piece of evidence, and Jeff mentioned that I actually play a role in this. It's kind of weird. You'd say, wait a minute, you were not even, you were 2 years old in 1945. What the hell do you got to do with this? Well, it happens that in 1996, there's a book published about a man named Theodore Alvin Hall, who's another scientist at Los Alamos who helps the Soviets. In the book is a reference to this same Exhibit 8. And I read the book, I call up Walter, I say, Walter, we always thought Exhibit 8 was a fraud. What's going on here? The guy who wrote the book, his name is Joe Albright, faxes me this Exhibit 8 diagram plus some documents, all in Russian. And I fax it immediately to Walter, and Walter looks at it, he says, wow, this has got to be David Greenglass's document, because he makes the same mistake on all of them. He says there's 36 pentagonal molds. In fact, there are actually 32, and they're not all pentagonal. For those of you who don't know what I said, it doesn't matter. Okay? But here's the most important thing about it. The document proves that it got to the Soviet Union in December of 1945. Now, if you've got something really important that you've just collected from your local spy people, you're going to wait 3 months to send it? Walter says, something's really weird about this, and sure enough, he finds in the Haunted Wood, 3 years later, that Ruth Greenglass meets with a Soviet person on December 21st, 1945. And that explains why it took that time. So Walter is able, by putting together everything, to discover what we've always believed, even after Venona and even after Morty. My father was framed for stealing the secret of the atom bomb. Just as Miriam and Abe were framed for espionage, even though they weren't even charged with it, my parents were framed for treason, even though they weren't even charged with it. And Walter has solved it, as far as I'm concerned.
So, and what we have, the attacks start to come on this book, and for very good reason, because the book is so good. But one of the attacks against them, one of the things you hear all the time, is that, well, they just changed their mind, and they're changing it again, and they're changing it again. But a historian who changes his or her mind based on new research is an honest historian, no?
Yeah, I mean, what's weird about this is that these attacks come from historians themselves. The whole point about history, there's a great quote somewhere, history is an argument without end. And to a certain extent that's true, because although we might agree on facts, we will maybe have continuing argument about what the facts mean. I mean, why is it that a new biography of Lincoln is interesting? You know, we know a lot about Abraham Lincoln, but every generation reinterprets the past. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with historians changing their mind. Any historian who doesn't change their mind isn't worth being a historian. So in a sense, it's rather absurd to say, they changed their mind, therefore we can't believe them now. Why not say they followed the evidence where it led and reached a new conclusion?
Now, but there is, I mean, I'd have to ask you about this. I mean, as you said before, you and Robbie changed your minds. How painful was it? Or was it?
It wasn't. It really wasn't. I'll tell you what was the first round of it. When 1975, when we got our first round of Freedom of Information Act material, and in it is a jailhouse informer, Jerome Eugene Tartico, who says Rosenberg confessed all the stuff that he did. I said, what? Is that possible? And that was sort of a shock, obviously, because up until that time we had always believed that there wasn't a scintilla of evidence in support of the government's case. But, you know, we were adults, and we could read, and we said, okay, let's examine this. And the second edition of We Are Your Sons actually has some fairly detailed effort to examine it, including the story of this guy, Jerome Eugene Tartico. In fact, before we got to finish the second edition of We Are Your Sons, the major attack on the Walter Miriam conclusion, Ronald Radosh and Joyce Milton's The Rosenberg File, comes out in 1983. So we knew that there was a possible counter-argument, and we knew that we had to deal with it. If it were true, we even right from the beginning said, if it's true, this is what it means.
And so what was your conclusion about Tartico?
My conclusion about Tartico was that he's totally unbelievable. And now, when Venona was released, we now understand what the FBI was doing with Tartico. They had the secret stuff that they had decrypted. They didn't want to let anybody know. They didn't even let people like Roy Cohn know. You know the story of Roy Cohn. You were going to read it, Philip. Roy Cohn told his biographer, Sidney Zion, that the government had secret evidence, but they couldn't introduce it at the trial because they had put wiretaps on people. But in fact, that means Roy Cohn himself didn't even know about Venona. Only J. Edgar Hoover knew about it, and some top people in Washington. I would venture to guess that Sapol, Cohn, Miles Lane, and James Kilsheimer didn't know about Venona. They were told the cover story, which Roy Cohn then later tells Alan Dershowitz on his deathbed. And that's why Sidney Zion, very interesting story, when Venona came out, Sidney Zion said, can't be true, otherwise Roy Cohn would have been told about it. Well, he was wrong.
It wasn't. In fact, in the 1970s, the FBI didn't believe Venona, and we know that because the allegations about Alger Hiss were being investigated by the FBI in 1952, the allegations that are in Venona, and they were completely disbelieving that any of this could be true. And what they dug up indicated that the charges about Hiss in Venona were not true, but they never ever stated to any of their agents what the source of this information was. Hoover, I think, was about the only one who knew, and he didn't believe it. Now, just one quick thing about Radosh. Radosh attacks the Schneirs for changing their minds, yet Radosh said in the Rosenberg file that Ethel was not guilty. Julius was. Now Ronald Radosh, in reviewing Final Verdict, insists that Ethel was guilty.
Yes, last night I tried desperately to find this one thing from a Ronald Radosh blog, and I'm sure it's still out there in cyberspace at one point. Obviously, when he said it, he must have been, in his cups, who the hell knows, because in print, he has only said that Ethel was a very active recruiter of Ruth. And in a blog, somebody wrote to him and said, well, what about, this argument that Ethel Rosenberg really was not an espionage agent because she didn't get a code name? He wrote back, and unless I'm crazy, I remember reading it, and it was only like 2 months ago, he wrote back, Vasilyev's notebooks show that she recruited both of them.
I have it right here.
You have it.
It's the LA Times. He said that
in print too?
In print.
Well, then he wasn't
LA
drunk.
Times. Now, and I want to get back to Radosh in a minute, but since we're talking about Ethel, one of the great things, one of the amazing things about Miriam's book, for those of you who haven't seen it, is there's a chapter in there about Miriam being in jail in Greenwich Village with Ethel. And it is the only thing that I have ever read which talks about Ethel not as a symbol, but as a woman, and who she was as a person. And so, without recasting the chapter for us, tell us what your most vivid memories are of Ethel as a person.
She was a very gentle woman. Jail is pretty hectic with women who are thrown together against their will. Some of them may have really been not guilty of anything, but all of them have a very descriptive, violent language. And the thing about Ethel that I remember the most was that in her presence, that language tamed and became pretty gentle for them. They didn't use the words that they would normally, that was normally part of their speech. She was a very understanding person, and she accepted them without difficulty, and they instinctively felt that she was a person who was not judging them and who was not an enemy, even though most of the women were black. I was white, obviously, so was Ethel. She had no trouble accepting her jailmates and talking to them, and they would yak away for hours because we had no assignments. We were not convicted. We were just being held, and their language was always very careful with her.
Tell me the scene when she is transferred. Describe for people here what you remember about her transfer.
Okay, it's hard.
I'm sure it is.
She passed me. She was in the cell opposite at an opposite angle to my corridor, we were milling about near the elevator, and she said, "I don't understand. I think Manny Block is here, and I just saw him yesterday, and I don't know what he wants today." So the elevator arrived, and she went down, and as she went down, the parallel elevator came up, and an officer got off it, went to her cell, began to strip it. It didn't take much for us to understand what was going to happen. She bundled Ethel's coat and things together, and she stripped the bed, the cot, no bed. And we understood. Somebody was coming for Ethel. She was going to be transferred. It's hard to describe the physical layout, but the area where the cars came to pick up prisoners to transport them elsewhere was, say, here, and we had a bank of cells this way. We all crowded into the cells overlooking that area where the car was going to pick her up, and we opened the window and we waited, and she appeared soon with her coat on with the marshals, and she was about to enter the car because this was when they were going to transfer her to Sing Sing. And when we saw her, we started to yell, "Ethel, Ethel." We really yelled, and there must have been about 12 or maybe more women at each of those windows yelling out to her. And
did she hear?
what?
Didn't she hear?
Oh, I'm sure she heard. She got in the car sped away, and the pictures the next day showed her smiling through the window. And there was the usual nastiness in the press about she seems to be a tough bird to be able to smile at such a moment. And this was typical of the press. They didn't understand or they didn't want to. But we knew that Ethel had heard us, and she was smiling to sort of cheer us up and tell us, don't worry about me.
When you just mentioned the press, and it leads to another point that you or Michael raised in your email, that obviously in your case this wasn't about espionage. What really this was really about was something else, wasn't it? Dissent? No, wasn't it really about stifling dissent?
Yeah. The government practiced on our trial and then went on to the Rosenberg trial. We were charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice. We were tried for espionage. I was tried for associating with it, but the trial focused on Brothman's having given secrets to Amtorg. In the Rosenberg case, it was the same switch.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's one of the contributions of the third book that's sitting up here, which is Dave and Emily Ullman's Exoneration, because Dave had made a very strong point that the word treason shows up all over the place, and it still does. And interesting that you previously mentioned Ronald Radosh. Probably for the first time ever, in his New Republic review of Walter's book, he actually referred to the treason committed by Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. Now, my brother always likes to do this with audiences, but I won't waste the time with the Q&A. But if somebody in this room would guess at the greatest act of treason in American history, you might be wondering until somebody says, oh yeah, the Civil War. Yeah, I guess that was the greatest act of treason in American history. Treason is defined in the Constitution, making war on the United States. It is impossible to commit treason in support of an ally, which is why Jonathan Pollard was not charged with treason. But that was the story in the case, and that was the story later on, and now it seems it's still the story today. And yes, it technically broke the law. Let's do a thought experiment. Suppose they had arrested my father in December of 1945 and said, we know that you've been recruiting people to help the Soviet Union during World War II. You know that's against the law, right? He said, yeah, I guess it is against the law. They said, all right, look, don't do any more of it. You know, suspended sentence or something like that. Or maybe they would have tried him and he would have gotten, 5-10 years or something like that. But 1950 is a different story. The Soviet Union is now an enemy. The Korean War starts after their address, but before the trial. And so during the trial, it's in the backdrop of the Korean War. And then it's a whole new ballgame. So work to help an ally during World War II suddenly becomes treason in 1950. And that's where this dissent thing comes in, because you don't just go after spies, but you go after anybody that might have been associated with them. You go after people, and you don't really care about the quote-unquote collateral damage. And, sorry to use another cliche, Miriam and Abe were collateral damage. Other people, a guy named Weldon Bruce Dayton, happened to, one of the people labeled in Venona ran off with his wife, and he then gets accused of maybe having been involved. They wouldn't let him have a passport for a whole bunch of years. There are plenty of people who were not involved in Soviet espionage who get tarred with the brush. And pretty soon, anybody who's any kind of leftist is a potential spy. And HUAC did this beautifully. They would go, whenever they'd ask you, are you a communist? And the next question was, are you a spy?
Right. And then who else was, and then give us the list of names. So you had the Hollywood 10, there were differences, huge differences among all these cases, but Hollywood 10, Alger Hiss, Judy Copeland, Miriam Moskowitz, the Rosenbergs, all those Smith Act cases mean, the Willard Remington case. The thing that unites them all, it seems to me, is not necessarily spy cases, but they're cases about dissent.
About communism.
About communism.
Particularly about communism. Yeah.
Right.
It's very important that communists be demonized. And that's, if we want to jump to today,
Yeah.
it remains, for some reason, it remains very important to at least some people in the intellectual community, some of them who've invested time and energy in it in the past and want to hold on to their reputation. Some of them are new to it. And, you know, it's kind of odd in some ways because, you know, there ain't no more Soviet Union. You know, communist China is, you know, the America's banker, all right? You know,
That's right.
you know, I mean, communist Vietnam, you know, they've got American plants there. Their workers are paid miserably. They are a wonderful source of cheap labor for international capital. I mean, the so-called communist threat is completely gone. But the principle remains, because what is the new threat? The new threat is, instead of the Red Scare, it's the Green Scare. It's Islamic terrorism. It's the people who are going to blow themselves up next door, and therefore, anybody with an Arabic-sounding last name or who's worships God following the Quran is suspect. It's the same principle. It's casting an outrageously wide net. Yes, there was espionage during World War II, and yes, horrible jihadist terrorists knocked down the World Trade Center. I am not one of these 9/11 conspiracies nuts. But that doesn't mean that everybody else that gets accused, from a lefty trade unionist to somebody who practices Islam, is obviously guilty.
But what was it about that period that when somebody posts a review of Final Verdict online, almost within 10 minutes, Ronald Radosh and his buddies and Harvey Clare and John Haynes have a rebuttal? What is it about what that might represent that Julius and Ethel may not be guilty? Why is that such a threat to them? And before we, I mean, to show what a personal threat it is, read this.
I actually could, yeah, this is interesting. Harvey Clare and John Haynes wrote a very nasty review of Walter and Miriam's book in the Weekly Standard. But what you don't know is that none other than Ron Radosh sent it to me with this email. Here's another one that destroys your arguments, Michael, from my Cold War buddies, as you call them. Now write another stupid letter. Very interesting that he says that. That means that he actually saw the letter I wrote to the New Republic, which they wouldn't print.
Right.
And saw the letter that I wrote to Commentary, which they wouldn't print.
And your letter was a point-by-point factual rebuttal, and yet it infuriates them. And so it seems to me that, well, I've done all this research into the Hiss case, and there's a certain worldview that came out of the Hiss case that the New Deal was soft on communism, that liberalism was really a communism in sheep's clothing. So what was it about the Rosenberg case that has these people still in such a dither 60 years later?
I must admit, I don't know if I have a good answer. I mean, I suppose part of it is just simple careerism, right? You write the definitive work on the Rosenberg case, and then your definitive work starts to, you know, melt away in front of you. You can do one of two things. You can be an honest historian like Walter Schneir and say, okay, here's my newest version, you know, I'm very impressed with the research of Walter Schneir. Here's what I think happened. But instead, the alternative is to dig in your heels and say, no, this is garbage, and I'm still the big boss. Remember me, I'm the guy who, gave up my old left-wing credentials to tell the truth about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. But, as to why other intellectuals are so wedded to this, some of it, the Haynes and Clare review of Walter's book in the Weekly Standard goes out of their way. Here, I'll read you one little passage. In the American criminal justice system, flaws, errors, exaggerations, corner-cutting, and sometimes tricks and bad faith are alas too common, but the system counts on its adversarial nature to create a balance as prosecution and defense point out errors. The heart of the historical issue is, and then they say it's, was Julius Rosenberg guilty as charged? Which, of course, that's what Walter answers. Walter answers that question. They fail to rebut any of Walter's specifics, but they are wedded to the idea that we, America, we don't make the kind of mistakes that other countries make. We don't politicize the judiciary. We actually are honest about things. And, it's just not true. It's not true. We have a long history of outrageous miscarriages of justice, and we ought to admit it.
Mike, I asked Miriam about her memories of Ethel. What are your most vivid memories?
Well, what's interesting, as Miriam was talking, I was thinking of a handful of memories from before the arrests of, I guess, quiet and calm, a kind of, very... Robbie is even better because it's pre-verbal. Mm-hmm. And Robbie says he has just a feeling of warmth. And it wasn't like my mother was this, saint. I mean, she was a punishing mother when I misbehaved. And, in the 1950s, we weren't averse to getting our asses whacked. And that happened from time to time. And she had energy. I do remember once some relative was complaining about my behavior, and she said, "You lay a hand on that kid, I'll break the floor beneath you." She had some energy, but she also, the image that Miriam got of that quiet gentleness and calm is an image that I get. And by the way, it hurt her at the trial. If you have read the letters, as I read them, typing every word of them, the two of them wanted desperately to appear dignified. And now you got to understand this. These are working class people. They had, they'd never learned to drive a car. My mother had hardly left her Lower East Side neighborhood. My father had gone to college and had been to Washington a couple of times. But the letters talk about dignity over and over and over again. Well, dignity at the trial meant sitting there calmly and not letting them get to you. Don't break down and cry. Don't be a schmo. Well, the jury reads that as emotionless. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's a sad commentary that, her calmness and her gentleness, struggling to maintain dignity, ends up being so horribly misread by these ordinary New Yorkers.
Right. And you talked about your mother. What about your father?
Well, my father was this, very active guy. He would take me all over the city, riding. I fell in love with the New York City subways and the 3rd Avenue L, riding in the front car, looking out at the switching tracks. I still like to do it now. Today, I noticed that you can't stand at the front of the number 4 train, so I had to sit down in the back. But it's really weird, and it's conceivable. Let's realize this. We know what he was doing, so it's conceivable that some of those trips he was meeting somebody. Who knows? So maybe I was involved in a different way.
You were collateral.
Collateral, yeah.
Now, one question that's often asked about your parents is about their keeping silent. And if one of the documents that surfaced is accurate, where Ethel says you have to be careful, which would indicate to some people that maybe she did know what was going on.
Oh, there's no question she knew. It's impossible.
She made a choice, and the choice was that they were going to go to their deaths and keep quiet. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I actually wrote something about that, I think.
You did?
Let's see if I can find it. Yeah. Some of you may have seen an article in Monthly Review by Staunton Lind, where he reviews, but he doesn't really review them. I wish he had said a little bit more about both Miriam's book and Walter's last book. But he makes two very interesting points that are probably worthy of discussion, maybe in our question period or maybe for the future. Two things. Why did Ethel and Julius refuse to cooperate? And he put it down to the simplest thing about in prison you don't snitch. Period, the end. What was the cause of the death sentence? The death sentence was, and now life imitates art. In E.L. Doctorow's novel, Daniel, the lawyer, the Manny Block character, says the death penalty was an investigative technique. It was torture. We torture you with the death penalty until you come across. And in the case of my mother, you torture my father with a gun to her head until you come across. Now, I have a little quibble with Staunton, because when my father was first interviewed by the FBI and says no, he'd never spent a day in jail. So he was already responding to a different view. And I think it's a simple view. I got all my friends to do this. We did it for good motives. I am not, because I was caught, going to put my friends in the same position. And when Morty was arrested, in effect, he followed my father and mother's lead. So now the question is, what about my mother? And in my daughter's film, again, our son asks the question, why didn't Julia say, oh, yeah, I did it, but Ethel had nothing to do with it, let her go? The answer is because the government already arrested her. They weren't going to say, oh, we're sorry, we'll let her go. It was all or nothing. And what is all or nothing? It's cooperate and name names. And that they wouldn't do. And my mother didn't even have a name to lead. And it's a very interesting question. The government knew all that. And yet, after my father was executed, they still killed her. She had no names. She had no thing. And so even if she had confessed, what could she have confessed to? That Julius was guilty. And then she spent her whole life in prison, having turned on her husband. And I think in the film, Abe Osheroff really makes the case. He says that their resistance was an unbelievable bonding. They depended on each other. And in so depending on each other, they couldn't let each other down. And I think at the end, if the rabbi's wife is accurate, Rabbi Kozlow actually says to my mother, Julius is gone, you're a widow, and you're leaving 2 children. Give him any name, give him a fake name. And she said, I have no names, I'm innocent, which we know now is true, and I'm ready. And it is an interesting question about, would some other person have said, okay, if I have a chance to be a mother to my kids, maybe I will say, yeah, Julie was involved, but I don't know anything else. But that might not have been enough. That might not have been enough. And that's the point. The point is trying to parse it. And that's the trap. Walter is beautiful in his book. The trap that my dad starts with is 3/4 of what's said about him is actually factually false. And the little bit that's true, what is he going to say? Yeah, I did this, but I didn't do that. Let's negotiate. And the result would have been feeding the political fires. He decided he wasn't going to play that game, and he actually hoped. It's hard to believe, but it's true. Abe Rothman told me this from being in jail with Dad. He really did believe that the American judicial system would exonerate him because he really was being framed. He had actually believed the movies, which is sad.
And Alger Hiss was, to the day he died, almost believed for exactly the same thing, that he was going to beat Whittaker Chambers because I'm innocent. And in a very private moment, he and Prosy were talking off to the side, and it was overheard by somebody else, and Prosy said, Alger, what are we going to do if you're convicted? And it was just the 2 of them in the room. Somebody happened to be outside. They didn't hear them. And Alger said, we're not going to be convicted. I'm innocent. And that's what happened. I want to get back to what, to me, Miriam, I keep bringing you back to these dramatic moments because they're so vivid in your book. You're released from prison, and you go see Irving Kaufman, which I have to say is, You're one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life. I'm not sure that was the smartest move you ever made, though. But tell the story about going to see Irving Kaufman.
I was in the vicinity of Foley Square, and suddenly I lost sense. It was like I was in a fog. I was going to go into the building and find Irving Kaufman, and I did. I really was not conscious at that moment. I walked up those steps, and I walked into the great amphitheater, and I looked at the directory, and it said Irving R. Kaufman, room such and such, and I took the elevator, and I went up. I was going to go into his office and just ask him, why did you do this to me? Put my hand on the doorknob, and a guard came up to me, and he said, they're not there, miss, they're on vacation. Scooted.
But you had a chance to confront him years later.
Oh, yeah. I confronted him when he was in his beer. He died February 2nd, 1983, and I wanted to go to the funeral, and I dropped everything and I ran in, and I parked the car on the west side and took the east side, the bus to the east side. He was parked at, he was buried from Park Avenue Synagogue, and it was a bitter, cold, windy day, and I stood outside. I didn't want to go into the synagogue because I didn't want anybody to think that I was a mourner. So I stood outside, and the wind blew at me, and it was bitter cold. And there was a ring of plainclothesmen in front of the building, and they began to eye me. And I thought, God, this is so many years later, and I'm still being watched. And police cars were patrolling up and down the avenue because they were expecting trouble. He had conducted a trial about some gangsters, and he found them guilty, and he sentenced them. And I think the New York City Police Department was afraid there might be some trouble from that source. But anyhow, I stood in front of this synagogue, stamping my feet, and it was on the corner, and I saw down the block that the service was about over because the ushers were coming out. So I walked down there. The ushers went into the roadway. They were looking for the hearse, and the traffic was heavy, so they were waiting, and they were talking between themselves. And there I was with Kaufman in the box. You don't want any more.
What did you say to him?
I said, I damn you for having, I forget the way I said it, for having played with the corrupt prosecution. And I went on, I was talking sort of under my breath. Now, I must have looked like I was praying, but I wasn't saying any El Morachron for him. And then I said, and if you thought, when you condemned Ethel and Julius, did you realize, I forget what I said, did you mourn when your two beloved sons were died thereafter? Oh, did you mourn your two beloved sons when they died, and did much as when you forget how I put it, when you created two lonely orphaned so many years ago.
That's it. Now-
That's it.
Now, before we wrap up the question and answer, I just have a quick question for both of you, which is, who do you blame? Who do you think was ultimately responsible? Who and what for what happened to you? And Michael, I'll ask the same thing for you about your parents. Who is to blame?
You're asking a really philosophic discussion. We have a culture in this country to get ahead at all costs. This was the post-Depression era, and there was a lot of ambition to get ahead now and to make up for lost time. Kaufman wanted a seat on the Supreme Court, and Justice Felix Frankfurter was heading for retirement, and he wanted that a post. Sapol and Cohen were intimately connected with Tammany Hall, which was basically a gangster-run organization. They were never, certainly Sapol was never going to rise much above a local government prosecutor. And the fever was growing about anti-communism. It had started in 1940 with the passage of the Smith Act, which made it a crime to overthrow, which made it a crime to advocate the overthrow or teach the overthrow of the government by force and violence. That act, by the way, was repealed not too long later. It was overthrown by the Supreme Court. But at that time, it was a focus for anti-communist, anti-Soviet fever.
So you're saying the ambition of the prosecutors
The ambition.
and the fever that took over the time.
Right, and
Right.
it's that kind of ambition that this system feeds all the time.
Michael?
Yeah, and I think it's important to make the connection to today is
Yeah.
that the designated enemy, it's very important for America to have a designated enemy. You know, we had a designated enemy when we were settling the West. It was the Indians. We had a designated enemy when we were hopping from California to the Far East. It was the Yellow Peril. We've always had designated enemies. It's been very useful because we do have democratic forms, and with democratic forms, people have the right to talk and argue and vote, and so people need to be channeled in their ideas. And if you have demons that you can motivate people to focus their anger on, they're not going to focus their anger on things that really matter. And it's happening today as
Even
well.
Julian Assange could be
Well, and that,
demonized.
it's very good that you mentioned that, because if he is indicted, it will be under the Espionage Act, the same law that was used for Dan Ellsberg and my parents.
Yeah, yeah.
And on that note,
Yeah,
we
that's
probably ought to let people
Yeah.
talk.
Before